There are nights that linger, nights that feel heavier than the hours they carry. Tonight, August 29th, 2025, is one of them. The air is warm, yet restless. Perhaps you're lying awake now, listening to the hum of your own thoughts, wishing for something gentle to carry you towards sleep. I know that feeling. And that is why we meet here, in the quiet, with a story. But not just any story. History has its own night songs, soft, haunting, and not always kind. Once, more than a century ago, comfort was found not in neat tablets or measured capsules, but in drops of amber liquid poured from tiny glass bottles. They called it laudanum. A miracle, they believed, a gift, a salvation. Yet salvation has a price. In Victorian London, beneath the fog and the trembling lamps, women began to fade. Their laughter quieted, their eyes grew hollow, their presence dimmed until they drifted through the city like shadows half-alive. People gave them a name, ghost ladies, as if their souls had slipped away while their bodies remained. Imagine it, a narrow street slick with rain, the faint glow of gaslight fighting the smoke, and behind a window, a woman sits motionless. Her hand rests on a vial. Her lips part as though to speak, but no words come. She breathes, and yet she is already gone. This is where our story begins. And if you find solace in these midnight wanderings, if these whispers of history help you rest, then let me gently ask, please subscribe, leave a like, or share your voice in the comments. It is how these forgotten echoes remain alive and how I know you are here with me, listening. So, close your eyes now and follow me back through the fog into a world where medicine promised peace, but delivered only ghosts. She sits by the window, still silent, her figure half hidden by the curtain, half lit by the faint flame of a gas lamp outside. The night fog presses against the glass, soft and heavy, swallowing the outlines of London. In that haze, her face looks almost translucent, pale as wax, drained of warmth. Her name is Eleanor Whitmore, but to those who pass in the street below, she is no longer Eleanor. Children whisper the ghost at the window as they hurry past, daring each other to look up. Neighbors shake their heads in pity, remarking that she has grown frail, unwell. Yet what they see is more than frailty, it is absence. A woman, present in body, but hollowed of spirit. In her hand rests a vial, small, ordinary. The amber liquid inside shivers with each breath she takes. Doctors call it laudanum. Society calls it a blessing. For years, it has been praised as a cure for pain, for sleepless nights, for nerves too tightly wound. A few drops bring calm, they say. A few drops grant rest. But Eleanor's stillness, her empty eyes, are the other side of that promise. The side people seldom speak of. Once, this room was alive. The scent of bread drifted from the kitchen. Flowers stood bright in a vase by the sill. Eleanor's laughter, warm and unforced, softened the edges of long days. Her children fell asleep to the comfort of her voice. Her husband returned each evening to her smile. These walls held color, warmth, and presence. But those sounds and scents have vanished. The bread grows stale, the flowers wilt too quickly. Her children tiptoe past her chair, afraid to disturb her trance. Her husband lingers longer at the bank, telling himself it is duty, though in truth it is fear. For when he looks at her now, he sees not the wife he once knew, but a figure fading, slipping into some quiet elsewhere. What has stolen her? Not grief, not madness, but something more insidious. Drop by drop, night after night, laudanum has drawn her away. At first it soothed her headaches, softened her restless nights. Then it became habit, a ritual. The vial by her side was no longer a cure, but a companion, and slowly, silently, it began to hollow her out. Look closer. Her lips are parted, as though she might speak. but no words come. Her skin is pale, stretched thin across delicate bones. The faint rise and fall of her chest is the only proof she still lingers here. To touch her hand would be to feel warmth without return. To meet her eyes would be to gaze into a distance you cannot follow. The room around her mirrors her decline. Dust gathers on the mantel. The clock ticks softly, hesitant, as though afraid to disturb the silence. Curtains hang heavy with soot. The air itself feels reluctant to move, heavy with absence. It is as if time itself has slowed in pity, unwilling to rush her toward the inevitable. Outside, London continues. Carriages clatter across whetstones. Street vendors call their last. Bargains flames sputter in the damp. The city is restless, loud, alive. But here, in this small chamber, there is only stillness, a life paused between presence and absence, between breath and shadow. And so we meet Eleanor, not at her beginning, but near her unraveling. She was not born fragile. She was not destined to fade. She has been unmade by what society once called progress, by a cure trusted too easily. The neighbors see only a sickly woman. The children see only a ghost. But the truth is harsher. Eleanor is the mirror of her age, a living warning carved into silence. She sits by the window, pale against the fog. The vial rests in her hand, her comfort and her coffin. Her story is not finished, but already her fate is written in every empty gaze, every silent breath. And we are left with a question not of what will become of her, but of how it ever came to this. London breathes like a restless giant. By day it is noise and smoke. By night it is shadow and flame. The fog never lifts fully. It lingers like a second skin, clinging to the bricks, the railings, the very breath of those who walk its streets. The air tastes of coal. Chimneys exhale black clouds that drift low over rooftops. Even the rain feels dirty, sliding down gutters in streaks of soot. Beneath this veil, thousands hurry along the narrow pavements, merchants, clerks, beggars, children. The sound of carriage wheels on cobblestones is constant, a rhythm that binds the city together. Gas lamps line the streets. Their light is weak, trembling, halos swallowed quickly by the mist. At night, each pool of yellow seems to guard a small circle of safety, while darkness swallows the spaces in between. It is here, in the shifting fog, that figures seem less like people and more like phantoms, passing one another in silence. London is a city divided to the west. Grand houses rise with marble steps and glittering windows. Coaches wait at the doors, and inside, parlors glow with laughter, music, and the clink of glasses. To the east, alleys twist into darkness, crowded with tenements where families of 6 or 7 share a single room. The smell of damp straw and sewage seeps from the bricks. Rats scurry where children should play. And yet, in both places, the same quiet hunger exists. In Mayfair drawing rooms, ladies sip tea laced with a few drops of laudanum gracefully, discreetly, as though it were nothing more than sugar. In the East End, mothers spoon syrup into the mouths of infants, not out of luxury, but desperation. The potion is called Godfrey's Cordialist Sweet Mixture that silences babies so their parents can work long hours in the mills. One city, 2 worlds, but the same amber liquid flows between them. The streets tell their own story. Listen, the shout of a costermonger selling fruit near Covent Garden, his voice hoarse against the clamor. The rattle of iron wheels near Whitechapel, carrying goods and sometimes bodies. The solemn toll of St. Paul's bells, marking another hour that feels heavier than the last. All of it blending into a music of industry, ambition, and exhaustion. In the fog, faces blur. A clerk hurries with papers tucked beneath his coat. A washerwoman bends beneath a basket dripping with wet linens. A gentleman, cane tapping, tips his hat as he passes. And somewhere among them, Unnoticed, a woman's step falters. Her hand lingers in her pocket, where a vial waits. No one stops her, no one asks. In this city, everyone has their own shadows to tend. Inside the taverns, relief is poured from mugs of ale. Outside the chemist's shop, it comes in bottles of laudanum. Both are spoken of casually, as part of life. The fog covers many things. The soot on the walls, the cracks in the stone, the slow fading of women who lean too heavily on a few drops of amber. This is the London Eleanor inhabits, not merely the city of her birth, but the stage upon which countless lives blur and fray. Progress shines in its railways, its factories, its endless appetite for growth. Yet beneath the glow lies fatigue, sorrow, and quiet dependence needs, so deep that when a vial is offered, most take it without question. Stand still long enough, and the city itself seems to shift. The fog thickens, cloaking the street in silence. A lamp flickers, and for a moment every passerby appears ghost-like. It is easy to imagine that the city is haunted not by spirits of the dead, but by the living who have been drained of life. Women like Eleanor, seated by their windows, their faces pale against the glass, their stories hidden in the mist. And so, London, proud capital of empire, becomes also a city of shadows, a place where invention and decay walk side by side, where wealth and poverty share the same fog, and where the cure so many trust begins to write its quiet, merciless script into the bodies of those who cannot escape it. It was called a gift. Doctors spoke its name with authority. Mothers whispered it with gratitude, and chemists sold it without hesitation. In small brown bottles lined neatly on shelves. It looked harmless, almost elegant. Laudanum at its heart. It was simple. Opium dissolved in alcohol, often sweetened with spices. A few drops in water, or in tea, and the body would soften. Pain retreated, muscles relaxed. A restless mind grew quiet. For headaches, for coughs, for women's nerves. For sleepless infants it was prescribed, again and again. And London, weary and overworked, embraced it. In drawing rooms, the ritual was discreet. A lady, seated among friends, would stir a teaspoon into her tea, as calmly as if it were sugar. She smiled more easily. Her voice grew softer. Her anxieties hushed beneath a veil of calm. Guests noted her poise, her elegance. No one mentioned the bottle hidden in her cabinet. In crowded tenements, it was survival. Mothers too poor to hire help, too exhausted to soothe a crying child, reached for something called Godfrey's cordial. Thick, syrupy, sweet on the tongue. It silenced babies quickly, granting precious hours of sleep or labor. Few asked what it contained. Few wanted to know that each spoonful carried laudanum into the fragile body of a child. It was not only the desperate who relied upon it. Factory workers used it to dull aches. From endless hours at the loom, clerks turned to it after nights of figures and ledgers that refused to end. Even the clergy whispered of its relief, taken in private, justified as a balm for the body, so the spirit could labor longer to many. It seemed almost divine. Here was a medicine that crossed all boundaries, rich and poor, young and old, noble and common. No one questioned it, because everyone needed it. In a world where pain was constant and rest scarce, laudanum offered what few things could: escape. But escape has two faces. At first it was gentle. The first drops brought ease, the second brought sleep. The next night, it was needed again. Soon, a woman who once took a teaspoon before bed now required 2, then 3, just to quiet her thoughts. Soon, the cordial spooned into an infant's mouth was measured not by caution, but by desperation. Still, society praised it. Doctors published reports extolling its virtues. Advertisements promised relief in flowing script, decorated with illustrations. of mothers cradling peaceful babies. Apothecaries filled prescriptions with a smile, the coin exchanged without question. If there were doubts, they were quieted. The evidence of relief was visible, immediate. The dangers slower, silent remained, hidden in the shadows, and so laudanum seeped into the very veins of the city. It was in the teacups of aristocrats, in the bottles of merchants, in the spoons of mothers, in the chrysor, the sudden silence of children. It crossed every threshold, carried in pockets and handbags, sitting innocently beside lamps and prayer books. Even Eleanor, sitting now by her window, once took it as a gift. Her doctor had pressed it upon her kindly, assuring her it was safe, common, almost ordinary. Just a few drops, he said. You will sleep, and in the morning the world will seem lighter. And he was right. At first, the world did seem lighter. The pain did ease. The nights were no longer restless. But as days turned into weeks, weeks into months, the vial at her side became more constant than her own children. She no longer slept without it. She no longer smiled without it. Slowly, drop by drop, the gift revealed itself to be a thief, and she was far from alone. London was filled with women like her wives, mothers, daughters, each holding her own bottle, each trusting the same cure. To look at them in passing, one might see only tired faces, faint smiles, a touch of pallor. But look closer, and their eyes told the truth. Something vital was slipping away. Laudanum was not merely a medicine, it was a quiet covenant between society and its suffering. A promise that life could be softened, even if only for a night. And so long as that promise held, no one wished to see the cost. Not yet. They began as whispers. A neighbor noticed a woman staring too long from her window. A child remarked that his mother's face looked like paper. A husband confessed, in low voice at the tavern, that his wife no longer laughed, no longer sang, no longer seemed quite real. And then the whispers spread. London, already thick with fog, seemed filled with pale figures, women who moved slowly, who blinked rarely, who sat as if waiting for something that never came. They were not dead, not sick in any way a doctor could measure, yet their presence unsettled everyone who'd looked too closely. They came to be called ghost ladies. You could see them in drawing rooms, seated among friends but silent, a cup of tea untouched in their hand. You could see them in markets, moving through the crowd with vacant eyes, buying bread as though sleepwalking. You could see them in churches, heads bowed, lips unmoving even as hymns rose around them. They were everywhere, and yet nowhere, present, but not alive. Eleanor was one of them. By now, her children no longer expected her stories at night. Her husband avoided her gaze, for in her eyes he saw not his wife but a stranger, distant and unreachable. She drifted through the house, like a shadow tiding absent-mindedly, folding linen without thought, pausing mid-step as though she had forgotten what steps were for. At times, she sat for hours in the same chair. At times, she wandered the hallways, fingers trailing the wall, muttering half-words that dissolved into silence. Always, the vial was near, and she was not alone in the East End. Mothers grew thinner, their skin pale from too many sleepless nights, eased by too many spoonfuls of Godfrey's cordial. Their children, lulled into unnatural quiet, looked almost spectral themselves. Small bodies, heavy with unnatural sleep. In Mayfair, ladies of fashion moved like porcelain dolls. Their gowns shimmered, jewels glinted at their necks, but their faces were blank, their smiles faint, their laughter forced. Behind their elegance was the same hollow stare, the same fragile stillness. Londoners began to notice, in the streets, people avoided their eyes. In taverns, men spoke of wives who no longer seemed human. In newspapers, cautious editorials referred to a troubling frailty among our women, though no one dared name it aloud. To accuse laudanum of harm was unthinkable. How could something so trusted, so praised, be the culprit? And yet the evidence walked among them, pale and undeniable. Even children saw it. They whispered stories of the ladies who float. They dared each other to knock on certain doors, to peek into certain windows where ghost-like mothers waited. They laughed nervously, but beneath the laughter was fear. For even the young could tell that something unnatural lingered in the city. It was not death. Death was familiar. It came swiftly, with fever, with plague, with accident. London had lived with death for centuries. This was something different. A slow vanishing, a living emptiness, a hollowing that left behind not a corpse, but a shell that still breathed. The city itself began to feel haunted. In the fog, every figure seemed suspect. Was that a tired washerwoman, or another ghost lady? Was that pale girl in the alley merely cold, or already halfway gone? The line between the living and the lost grew thin, blurred by the amber liquid so many trusted, and yet no one spoke too loudly. The ghost ladies were mothers, wives, sisters, daughters. To admit their fading was to admit society's failure. So London carried on, pretending not to see. The carriages still rattled, the factories still roared, the churches still rang their bells. But beneath it all, the city whispered, uneasy, as the ghost ladies multiplied. Eleanor, by her window, was only one among many, a single story in a chorus of silence. And as the fog thickened, she seemed less like a woman trapped by circumstance, and more like a symbol and emblem of a time that had mistaken poison for cure, shadow for comfort. The ghost ladies had become London's quiet epidemic, and the question, whispered now in fear, was no longer just why, but how many more. The fog thickened as summer turned to autumn. In the crowded streets, pale figures multiplied. At first it was coincidence, a weary wife at the market, a silent woman in church, but soon the pattern could not be denied. Everywhere, women sat motionless by windows, drifted slowly through alleys, moved like shadows through parlors and shops. London had become a city of echoes, haunted not by spirits of the dead, but by the living half-vanished. They were called ghost ladies now, not only in whispers, but aloud. Children sang rhymes about them. Satirists sketched them in the margins of newspapers, pale women with wide eyes, holding teacups or cradling silent infants. In taverns, men muttered nervously about wives who stared too long into nothing. Even doctors, though still prescribing the same amber liquid, began to shift uncomfortably at the growing number of unwell. Women who never seemed to recover, and yet the vials continued to sell. Chemists' shelves remained lined with laudanum. Advertisements promised relief, comfort, rest. For every complaint, one broadside read, "A few drops will suffice." Mothers still carried bottles in their aprons. Ladies still kept them in elegant cabinets. The medicine had not lost its reputation. Society did not yet see poison. It saw salvation. The contradiction was unbearable. To admit the truth was to condemn not only a drug, but the very foundations of trust in medicine, in progress, in modern life. And so London lived with its ghosts, pretending they were merely frail, merely tired, merely unlucky. The city, in its hunger for comfort, had chosen blindness. Eleanor remained at her window. She had become a fixture as permanent as the fog itself. Her children grew used to her silence. Her husband stopped asking questions. The neighbors no longer pitied her. They avoided her gaze altogether. She was still breathing, still moving faintly through her house, but she had ceased to belong to the living dot. She was not alone in every district, from Mayfair to Whitechapel. There were women like her, pale, quiet, hollowed. Together they formed a silent chorus, a citywide haunting that no one dared name for what it was. An epidemic born not of plague or famine, but of trust. London had survived fire, had survived pestilence, had survived war. But this was different. This was a slow unmaking from within, a gentle thief, disguised as cure, creeping through parlors and nurseries alike. And so the city stood on the edge of a revelation. The ghost ladies were not simply women too, fragile for their time. They were the proof of something larger, something darker, a failure hidden beneath the polished veneer of progress. How could a society so proud of its reason, its science, its empire, allow such a thing? How could doctors, trusted as guardians of health, hand out bottles that hollowed rather than healed? How could families, desperate for rest, place their faith in something that slowly erased the very people they loved? These questions hung heavy, unspoken, in the fog. For Eleanor's story was not only her own, it was the story of a city, an age, a world that mistook poison for comfort. And if the ghost ladies were the symptom, then the cause lay deeper in the heart of Victorian medicine itself. And that is where we must go next. Victorian medicine wore the mask of certainty. Doctors strode through London's streets in tall hats and dark coats, their black bags swinging at their sides, symbols of knowledge and authority. Patients welcomed them as men of science, men who understood the mysteries of the body. But behind the polished mask lay uncertainty, guesswork, and a science still learning to walk. Hospitals were crowded, dim, and unsanitary. The air inside was thick with the scent of carbolic acid and unwashed linen. Surgical theaters filled with curious onlookers who came as if to watch a performance. Anesthesia was new, antiseptics newer still, and death was common. Physicians were less healers than managers of symptoms, prescribing whatever eased pain, quieted coughs, or stilled the mind, rarely asking why illness had come in the first place. In this fragile landscape, laudanum shone like a star. Here was a medicine that worked instantly, visibly, undeniably. A few drops, and the patient sighed with relief. The headache softened, the cough faded, the restless child stilled, the anxious woman slept. To a doctor accustomed to offering little more than hope and prayer, laudanum was not simply a tool. It was a triumph. It is easy now, from the vantage of centuries, to condemn them. But imagine yourself in their place, a patient moaning in pain, a mother desperate for rest, a laborer crippled by exhaustion. What would you give for a cure that soothed all of them with a single vial? In the dim glow of a Victorian surgery, laudanum was not poison. It was mercy. And so bottles passed easily from hand to hand. Doctors prescribed it for headaches, toothaches, stomach cramps, women's troubles, melancholy, sleeplessness. They prescribed it for infants, for soldiers, for the elderly. There was no part of life it did not touch. The boundary between medicine and daily habit blurred. Laudanum was less a drug than a companion always present, always ready. The chemists profited. Shops displayed their wares with confidence, labels ornate, promises bold. A gift to soothe, one advertisement read. Safe, certain, swift. There was no regulation, no warning. The dose depended on the hand that poured, the faith of the one who swallowed. Some bottles contained far more opium than others. Some syrups mixed it with sugar, wine, or even alcohol strong enough to fell a horse. Yet still, they sold, day after day. The public trusted them. Trust was woven into the very fabric of Victorian society. The empire was expanding, science advancing, progress marching forward. If a medicine bore the voice of a doctor, the seal of a chemist, the approval of neighbors who would doubt it, to question was to risk appearing ignorant or ungrateful. And so laudanum flowed freely, unquestioned. But beneath the trust, a silence grew. The first signs were subtle. A woman who no longer smiled, a child who slept too deeply, a man who returned again and again for another vial. Doctors noticed, but explained it. A frailty, nerves, the strain of modern life. They did not yet have the words for dependence, for addiction. They did not yet see that their triumph was quietly undoing the very lives it sought to heal. This was the world Eleanor inherited. A world where science walked proudly, but on unsteady legs. A world where doctors believed they had found a universal cure, even as it hollowed their patients from within. A world where the line between healer and unwitting accomplice blurred in the fog of ignorance. And so, in the heart of Victorian medicine, laudanum was not a danger. It was a blessing, at least that is what they told themselves. To understand laudanum, you must imagine not the rare occasion, but the ordinary day. For it was not only in hospitals or chemists' shops that this amber liquid was used. Was in kitchens, parlors, nurseries, even in pockets carried through the streets. In the drawing rooms of Mayfair, it hid in plain sight. A lady would pour her tea, add a spoon of sugar, then, with graceful discretion, a few drops of laudanum. Her friends smiled at her calm demeanor, her gentle laughter. They did not notice the faint glaze in her eyes, the way her smile lingered too long, as though painted. In these circles, the medicine was not spoken of as indulgence, but refinement and aid to composure, a tool for elegance. In the East End, it was survival. Factories demanded 14 hours a day, sometimes more. Mothers, already worn thin, found no rest in homes crammed with noise and need. A bottle of Godfrey's cordial became their ally. Sweet, thick, and laced with laudanum, it silenced crying infants in minutes. The children slept, heavy and unnatural, but quiet. And in the precious silence, mothers worked, cleaned, or simply closed their own eyes for a moment's escape. They knew it was strong. They did not know it was deadly. Clerks carried it, too. Men in waistcoats, bent over ledgers in lamplight, relied on drops of laudanum to push through exhaustion. Their employers praised their discipline, never asking what fueled their long hours. To admit dependence would have seemed weak, unmanly. Yet more than one clerk was seen slipping into sleep at his desk, eyelids heavy from the very cure that kept him working. Children were not spared. Laudanum tinctures were marketed for teething pains, for coughs, for restlessness. Infants dosed into silence, toddlers lulled to sleep too quickly. Many parents believed they were caring, merciful even. After all, the child stopped crying, the feverish brow cooled, the little body stilled. Only later, when the infant would not wake, did the truth begin to whisper its warning. And in the quiet corners of London's churches, even the clergy were not immune. A priest, weary from endless sermons and confessions, might keep a bottle in his study. Just a drop, he told himself, for strength. Just a drop, to soothe the nerves. And so faith and laudanum shared the same table prayers for the soul, tinctures. For the body it was everywhere. In elegant cabinets beside porcelain cups, in cracked cupboards of tenement kitchens, in the pockets of laborers and the handbags of widows. A medicine so common it ceased to feel like medicine at all. And because it was everywhere, it was invisible. No one questioned a bottle on the mantel or a vial in a handbag. No one frowned when a mother quieted her child with a spoonful of cordial. No one whispered disapproval when a lady stirred a few drops into her tea. To question would have been stranger than to accept. Eleanor was no exception. She began, as others did, with trust. A doctor's kind words, a neighbor's quiet recommendation, a husband's reassurance that it was safe. Just a few drops, they said. Everyone uses it. And so she used it, and so it used her. Day after day, laudanum slid seamlessly into the rhythm of life. The church bell tolled, the market opened, the factories roared. The fog thickened, and in houses across the city, vials tilted, drops fell, cups lifted. The city moved, soothed by a substance that promised rest even as it sowed emptiness. London was not simply a city in fog. It was a city lulled, softened, drifting half awake. Half asleep, its pulse, slowed by a liquid it trusted too much. And though the people did not yet see it, the cost was already being written. In pale cheeks, in silent nurseries, in eyes that no longer met your own. If laudanum was the silent companion of adults, then Godfrey's cordial was its cruel gift to children. The cordial looked harmless, a thick, dark syrup, sweetened with treacle, flavored with herbs, and sold in cheap glass bottles. Its advertisements promised peace to the household. Godfrey's cordial, the mother's friend. The child's comfort. Mothers clutched at those words like lifelines. For pennies, they could buy silence, rest, relief. The truth was harsher. Every spoonful carried not only sweetness, but laudanum. The same opium that dulled pain in adults now flowed into the fragile bodies of infants. It quieted them swiftly, yes, but it did not nourish, did not heal. It only silenced. Picture a tenement in the East End, a single room, damp with rain seeping through cracked walls. A mother returns home from the factory, her body aching, her mind frayed from the relentless rhythm of machines. In the corner, her child wails, hungry, feverish, inconsolable. The mother has no strength left to soothe. She opens the cupboard, takes down the bottle, pours a spoonful into the child's mouth. The crying stops. The silence is immediate, shocking. The mother breathes out, shoulders sagging with relief. For the first time that day, the room feels still. She does not ask herself why the baby sleeps so heavily, why the breath is shallow. She tells herself it is kindness. She tells herself it is care. And in a way, it is care born of desperation. Factories demanded labor. Poverty demanded endurance. Without rest, without silence, survival itself seemed impossible. The cordial gave them time, gave them strength to return to the mill the next morning. It became as necessary as bread. But the price was terrible. Infants weakened. They failed to thrive, their limbs too thin, their eyes too dull. Some never woke at all. Death certificates spoke of convulsions, of failure, of unknown causes. Few dared to write the truth. Overdose. Even fewer dared to question whether the cure itself was killing the very children it claimed to comfort. The cordial was not confined to the slums. In more comfortable homes, it was given for teething pains, for coughs, for sleeplessness. A crying child was quickly soothed, the household restored to peace. Parents praised the syrup, recommended it to friends. To doubt it was to admit weakness, to confess that one could not manage a child without help. And so it spread, as natural as milk, as ordinary as sugar. Bottles stood beside lamps on kitchen shelves, tucked into baskets for outings, carried in handbags to church. A spoonful before a service kept the baby quiet through the hymns. A spoonful, at night, bought parents a few hours of unbroken sleep. Everyone knew it worked. Few asked how. The tragedy was not in malice, but in trust. Mothers did not wish harm on their children. They loved them, fiercely, but they were tired, they were poor. They were told again and again that this cordial was safe, helpful, a gift. And when exhaustion pressed like iron upon their shoulders, they chose relief over doubt. The city, too, turned away. Officials did not intervene. Doctors, many of whom prescribed laudanum themselves, rarely condemned the cordial. And so the silent epidemic spread. Children stilled, mothers hollowed, households lulled into uneasy quiet. To walk the streets of London was to hear less crying than one might expect, not because children were happier, but because their voices had been muted. The silence itself became a kind of ghost, haunting tenements and parlors alike. Eleanor, too, had used it once. Not often. She was not among the poorest, but once. When her son was ill and sleepless, she had given him a spoonful. The stillness that followed had unsettled her, even as relief washed over her. She told herself it was harmless, that others used it daily, but in the back of her mind, she wondered, had she traded a cry for a breath? Godfrey's cordial was more than medicine. It was a symbol of an age that chose ease over questions, silence over struggle, a sweetness masking sorrow, a spoonful of peace that too often tasted of death. And in that choice, London revealed itself. A city desperate for comfort, willing to pay with the very voices of its children. The vial gave comfort. It eased headaches, stilled nerves, softened the long nights, when the body refused to rest. But comfort, taken too often, became hunger. And hunger, drop by drop, began to hollow. Eleanor changed slowly at first. Her laughter, once quick and genuine, grew softer, rarer, until it vanished altogether. Her eyes lost their warmth, the way they used to brighten at the sight of her children. She still looked at them, yes, but the gaze seemed to pass through them, as if they were part of the fog outside her window. Her husband noticed, but told himself it was weariness, nothing more. He did not want to name the fear that crept into him each time she turned away. The hollowing did not announce itself. It arrived like damp through stone unseen, gradual, but unstoppable. A missed meal here, a forgotten shore there. A day when Eleanor did not rise until noon. A night when she drifted into sleep with the vial still in her hand, each instant small, forgivable. Yet together they built a silence that filled the house like a tide. Her children adapted first. They learned not to ask for stories at night. They no longer tugged at her skirts, no longer pleaded for her attention. Instead, they tiptoed around her chair, whispering to each other as though their mother were a fragile statue. They still loved her, but in the way one loves a memory distant, untouchable. Already half gone, her husband changed too. Once he hurried home each evening, eager for her smile. Now he lingered at the bank, finding excuses for late work. When he did return, he sat in silence, watching her from across the room, searching her face for the woman he had married. He still saw her features, familiar as ever, but the spirit that animated them seemed lost. At times he wondered if grief might have been easier than this slow erasure. And Eleanor herself, did she know? Perhaps. There were moments when clarity broke through, when she caught sight of her reflection in the glass. She saw the pale cheeks, the distant eyes, the hand clutched tightly around the bottle. A flicker of fear crossed her face. But then the ache returned, the restlessness pressed in, and the vial was at her lips once more. The fear passed, replaced by the soft blur of oblivion. She was not alone. Across the city women moved through the same transformation. In elegant parlors, wives sat dazed while conversations swirled around them. Their gowns shimmered, their jewels sparkled, but their voices were faint, their laughter brittle. In tenement rooms, mothers collapsed into uneasy sleep beside silent children, their own bodies weakened by spoonfuls taken too often. Everywhere, women became shadows of themselves, ghost-like figures moving through fog. The city had learned to live with absence. Husbands avoided questions. Neighbors shrugged, muttering about nerves, frailty, the burdens of womanhood. Even doctors, confronted with pale patients who begged for more, prescribed again, unwilling to admit that the cure itself was the cause. To acknowledge it would mean dismantling the trust upon which their profession rested. And so silence grew. But silence is not harmless. In homes like Eleanor's, it meant children raised without warmth. Husbands sleeping beside strangers, families reduced to structures without hearts. In the city at large, it meant an epidemic unnoticed, a ghostly emptiness spreading not through contagion but through custom. The hollowing was not dramatic. It did not rage like fire, did not strike like plague. It seeped, it crept. It wore down the edges of life, until what remained was only form, not substance. And that was its cruelty. It allowed the body to remain while the spirit slipped quietly away. Eleanor sat by her window, as she always did. The fog curled against the glass. The lamp flickered. Her hand tightened around the vial. Somewhere inside her, a voice whispered that she was fading. But the whisper was faint, and the comfort stronger. And so she drank, and so she drifted, and so she hollowed. And all across London, other women did the same. The bottles remained on shelves. The advertisements continued their promises. And still, night after night, women sat silent by their windows, their children hushed, their families drifting further into absence. The city called it progress. But beneath the veneer of comfort, the cost was mounting. It was a cost counted not in coins, but in silences. In parlors where conversations faltered because wives no longer spoke. In kitchens where children learned to keep their voices low. In beds where husbands turned away, unsure if the woman beside them was still their wife, or a stranger wearing her face. It was a cost written in empty gazes. The clerk's wife, staring at the fire for hours without stirring. The seamstress's sister, forgetting her needle mid-stitch, hands trembling. The merchant's daughter, pale and listless, eyes rimmed with dark hollows. Each family had its own ghost, and yet few dared admit what they saw. To speak of it was to risk shame, or worse, to question the very cure that society had built its trust upon. The newspapers hinted at it, cautiously. Editors wrote of a troubling weakness among our women, of nerves frayed by the pace of modern life. Some urged moderation, suggesting that mothers use with care. But no one dared name laudanum as the culprit. Too many readers relied upon it. Too many advertisers paid to praise it. To accuse the cordial was to accuse the age itself, and so the silence deepened. Doctors felt the weight, but turned away. They saw patients return paler, weaker, more dependent than before. They prescribed again, convincing themselves that frailty was natural, that nerves were simply too delicate for modern strain. Few were ready to admit that the very medicine in their black bags might be hollowing the lives they were sworn to protect. Meanwhile, the city adjusted. Employers looked the other way when clerks faltered at their desks. Churches accepted the vacant stares of women in their pews. Neighbors avoided the houses where children no longer cried, because to ask why would mean hearing an answer too dark to bear. And so, London carried its ghosts quietly, but the cost could not remain hidden forever. Every vial emptied left another woman further from herself, another family further from wholeness. The children grew in silence, learning absence as their first language. The men worked longer hours, haunted by the hollowness at home. The women drifted, softer, paler, fainter, until their presence was less life than shadow. Eleanor embodied it. Her children rarely touched her hand anymore. It felt too cold, too unresponsive. Her husband no longer searched her eyes. He feared what he would do or would not find. And Eleanor herself, sitting by the window, no longer asked why. She simply drifted, the cost written into her very stillness. The city could not name it, but it could feel it. A heaviness in the air, a silence too deep, a sense that something vital was slipping away. It was the price of a cure to trust it, a comfort too quickly embraced. And though the streets bustled, though the factories roared, though the empire grew rich, London was paying in souls what it gained in wealth. The cost was unspoken, but it was everywhere, and soon it would no longer remain in whispers. It always began with a few drops, enough to take the edge off a headache, to calm a restless night, to ease the weight of a day too heavy to bear. Eleanor measured them carefully at first. A teaspoon in her tea, just as the doctor advised. The relief was quick, certain, almost miraculous. She told herself it was medicine, nothing more. But the body is clever, it remembers. The next time the ache returned, the same measure felt weaker. The nights grew longer, the rest harder to reach. A little more, she thought. Just one more drop. And when that worked, the new measure became habit. What had once seemed indulgent became ordinary. What had once seemed enough was suddenly too little. The vial grew lighter, faster. Her husband noticed first. The bottles on the mantel emptied more quickly than before. He mentioned it once, lightly, almost as a joke. Eleanor smiled faintly, said nothing, and the subject was dropped. After all, she was not ill. She did not stumble through the streets, did not drink herself into ruin like the poor wretches in taverns. She was refined, careful, composed. She only needed a little more rest, a little more calm. But calm was slipping from her. The more she drank, the paler she became. Her hands trembled when the vial was not near. Her days blurred into one another, each marked by the measure of laudanum that carried her from morning to night. The children no longer asked when she would join their games. They knew she would not. She was not alone in parlors across the city. Ladies leaned heavier on their hidden bottles. They laughed at jokes that were not funny, their voices too light, their smiles too slow. Everyone needed it. To question was to admit weakness, and weakness was not fashionable. In tenements the pattern was harsher. Mothers spooned cordial into infants more often, longer, thicker. The silence in their rooms lasted not hours but days. Some children grew too still, their sleep too deep. When neighbors asked, mothers shrugged, saying only that the babies had been difficult, that the cordial was the only thing that helped. No one pressed further. In poverty, survival left no room for questions. Even the doctors, though uneasy, prescribed more. They had few alternatives. What else could soothe the endless complaints of patients, headaches, coughs, nerves, grief, exhaustion? And when a patient returned asking for another bottle, weaker, paler, trembling well, perhaps her constitution was delicate. Perhaps she simply needed more. It was easier to prescribe than to doubt. The growing dose spread like fog. It was not seen as excess, but adjustment. Not abuse, but necessity. London itself seemed to lean heavier with each passing year, dulled. Sometimes she poured without looking, the liquid spilling more than intended. Sometimes she sipped directly from the vial, promising herself it was only this once, only tonight. She no longer remembered how few drops had once sufficed. That world had vanished, along with the warmth in her cheeks and the brightness in her eyes. Her husband no longer joked. He watched, he waited, he feared. The woman he had known was fading, not suddenly, but steadily like a candle burning down, flame still present, but shrinking with every hour. And Eleanor herself, she no longer asked if it was too much. She only asked if it was enough. The hollowing. When Eleanor faded, so did her household. The silence she carried seeped into every room, reshaping the life of those around her. Her children felt it first. They were young, but children know absence more keenly than adults. They no longer asked for bedtime stories. The soft rhythm of their mother's voice had long since vanished. They no longer tugged at her skirts, for her hands, once quick to caress, now trembled with a vial, instead of reaching for them. They still loved her, yes, but in the way one loves a memory, distant and untouchable. Their laughter grew quieter. Their games were played in whispers. The house had become a place of caution, not joy. Her husband carried his own silence. In the beginning, he spoke gently, urging her to rest less on the bottle. Later, he spoke sternly, reminding her of the children, of her health, of the woman she used to be. But each word fell against a wall of glass. Eleanor smiled faintly, nodded, and the vial remained in her hand. At last, he stopped speaking. He lingered longer at the bank, returning home only when duty demanded it. To sit across from her at the dinner table was to sit across from absence itself. He could not bear it, and so he chose distance. Thus, the family lived together, but apart. Meals were eaten in silence. The children learned to ask their father, not their mother, for what they needed. Nights passed without warmth, mornings without welcome. The house was not broken by shouting or violence, but by a deeper fracture. The slow erosion of presence, the kind that leaves walls standing but hollows the rooms within. Eleanor was not unique. Across London, the same cracks appeared in households rich and poor. In Mayfair mansions, gentlemen whispered of wives who no longer entertained guests, who drifted through parlors like pale ornaments, their elegance untouched but their spirit gone. In cramped tenements, fathers came home to children unnaturally quiet, mothers lying pale on beds, cordial bottles half empty on the shelf. These cracks spread quietly, rarely spoken of aloud. Respectability demanded silence. A gentleman did not admit that his wife was absent in spirit. A working man did not confess that his children were fed more cordial than bread. To acknowledge the truth was to invite shame, and so the truth remained hidden, whispered only in corners, passed off as nerves or frailty. But the silence cost dearly. Children raised without the warmth of a mother's gaze grew wary, uncertain. Husbands carried their grief in solitude, wearing it like an invisible weight. Families that had once been whole now moved like fractured parts, coexisting but never connecting. The hearth, once the center of life, became instead a cold place where shadows gathered, and Eleanor did she feel the cracks? Perhaps. There were moments when her eyes flickered with recognition, when she reached out, briefly, to brush her child's hair, only to retreat as if the gesture were too heavy. There were nights when she looked at her husband across the table, lips parting as though to speak, but no words came, and then the vial was at her lips again, and the moment passed. This was the cruelty of laudanum. It did not destroy suddenly. It stole slowly, piece by piece, until families remained outwardly intact, yet inwardly broken. No scandal, no violence. Already cloaked in fog, now carried another kind of mist. The invisible haze of households eroded from within, and as those cracks widened, they revealed not only the fragility of families, but the fragility of the society that depended on them. Eleanor's house was just one among thousands, but in its silence, its distance, its quiet grief, it told deep from a bottle trusted too much. The East End was a world apart. In one room, a family of 6 huddled together, their breaths clouding the cold air. In another, a widow took in boarders. Work was endless, pay was meager, and the cries of hungry children rose above the rattle of carts and the hiss of factories. In this world, silence was precious, not peace, not rest, simply silence. A crying child meant a day's labor lost, a night without sleep, another neighbor's complaint. For mothers who worked 12-14 hours in the mills, whose hands bled from washing laundry, whose backs ached from endless scrubbing, thick, sweet, affordable. A spoonful in the mouth of a wailing infant, and the cries stopped within minutes. The child's eyes fluttered closed, his body slackened, his small chest rising and falling in heavy rhythm. The mother exhaled, her shoulders sagging with relief. For a moment, the room was still. For a moment, she could think, or rest, or simply survive. But survival came at a price. Children dosed too often grew weak, their limbs thin, their faces pale. They slept too long, too deeply, as if carried into another world. Some never woke at all. Their deaths were quiet, often blamed on fever, on frailty, on fate, rarely on the cordial. To accuse it would be to accuse themselves, and no mother could bear that truth. Still, the cordial was used, day after day. What choice did they have? Factories would not wait for mothers to soothe infants. Employers would not excuse absence. for a child's cries. The cordial was a cruel bargain. Silence now, sorrow later, and in the exhaustion of poverty, silence now always won. Picture one such mother. Her name could be Mary, or Anne, or countless others. She rises before dawn, her body sore from yesterday's work. Her child cries in the dark, restless, hungry. She rocks him, hums to him, but her arms ache, her eyelids droop. At last she reaches for the bottle. One spoonful, the crying stops. She kisses his forehead, whispers an apology he cannot hear, and leaves for the mill. All day she wonders if he still breathes. And when she returns, if she finds him alive, still sleeping, she thanks the cordial. She tells herself it saved him. She tells herself it saved her. Tomorrow she will do the same. The East End was filled with mothers like her, each one carrying both love and guilt, each one trapped between desperation and hope. They did not wish to harm their children. They wished only to endure. But endurance, bought drop by drop, hollowed both mother and child alike. The city knew, though it did not speak. Doctors recorded infant deaths in vague terms. Neighbors whispered, but did not accuse. Newspapers ignored the alleys of Whitechapel and Stepney, preferring stories of politics and empire. And so the mothers carried their burden alone, their sorrow, folded into silence, as heavy as the fog outside their doors. And in that silence, they too became shadows. Not yet the ghost ladies of Mayfair, seated elegantly in parlors, but ghost ladies of another kind, women, whose exhaustion drained them, whose eyes dulled, whose spirits bent beneath the weight of both poverty and laudanum. The East End was haunted, not by spirits of the dead, but by the living who had been given no other choice. And among those narrow streets, among the soot and the cries and the silence, London revealed its deepest truth. The ghost epidemic was not born only of luxury, it was born of desperation. While the mothers of the East End poured cordial into the mouths of their children, the ladies of Mayfair poured laudanum into their tea-dot here. The fog smelled less of sewage and smoke, more of perfume and polished wood. Mansions rose in rows, each with marble steps and glittering chandeliers. Inside, parlors glowed with the warm light of candles, the notes of a piano drifting through the air. Servants moved quietly between rooms, trays balanced with cups of tea and silver spoons. Laughter rang, soft and elegant, as ladies reclined on velvet chairs. Yet even in these salons, silence lurked. A guest might notice it in the pause before a laugh, in the faint delay before a reply. A hostess might smile too serenely, her eyelids heavy, her words measured and slow. On the table beside her cup, a small vial might rest, brown glass, ordinary in appearance, extraordinary in its hold. This was laudanum in its most fashionable form, not survival, as in the East End, but refinement, not desperation, but discretion. The ladies called it a comfort for the nerves, a remedy for sleepless nights. They never spoke of dependence. They never admitted that the amber drops were no longer optional, but essential. Behind lace curtains, the ritual was constant. A few drops stirred into tea before guests arrived to smooth the anxiety of hosting. A spoonful before bed to soften thoughts that otherwise tangled in the dark. A sip at midday to quiet the vague restlessness of a life too idle, too constrained by social expectation. It was not spoken of openly, but it was understood. Friends exchanged knowing glances when one of them seemed calmer than usual. Sisters shared bottles across polished tables, whispering that it was safe. Everyone uses it. Husbands, proud of their wives' composure, seldom asked why their composure seemed purchased, why their smiles grew thinner, their cheeks paler. The effect was subtle, but undeniable. Ladies who once filled rooms with laughter now seemed quieter, slower. their movements graceful but detached, as though performed from a distance. Their beauty remains, silks still shimmered, jewels still glittered, but the life within was dimmed, replaced by a strange stillness. They became ornaments in their own homes, admired but absent, and still society praised them. Guests spoke of their elegance, their serenity, their composure under strain. No one dared to say that serenity was drugged, that composure was purchased in drops of laudanum, for to admit it would be to unravel the illusion of refinement upon which Mayfair thrived. Thus, the ghost ladies of Mayfair were different from those of the East End, not weary from labor, not driven by desperation, but hollowed by a medicine that promised grace. They haunted not alleys, but drawing rooms, not tenements, but parlors with golden mirrors. Eleanor could have been one of them. Had her circumstances been different, she might have reclined on velvet, a vial hidden in her sleeve, her silence praised as poised rather than pitied as illness. For in truth, whether in silk or rags, the pattern was the same: a woman, a bottle, a slow unraveling. London was a city of contrasts, yet laudanum leveled those contrasts, weaving through classes with the same quiet thread. It did not care whether it rested in a mother's apron pocket or a duchess's ivory drawer. Its work was the same: easing, soothing, hollowing, and so. Mayfair, with all its chandeliers and polished floors, carried ghosts as surely as Whitechapel did. They were only dressed more beautifully. London had always been a city of contrasts. The polished carriages of Mayfair rolled past the soot-stained alleys of Whitechapel. The bells of St. Paul's rang above the cries of street vendors in Spitalfields. But as laudanum spread, the contrasts blurred. Everywhere, rich or poor, pale figures moved through fogwomen, hollowed by the same amber liquid. Families fractured by the same silence. In the East End, mothers carried bottles of cordial in their aprons, dosing their children into quiet sleep, so they might endure another shift at the mill. In Mayfair, ladies stirred laudanum into tea, smiling faintly through soirees, their elegance masking absence. Two worlds, distant in wealth, shared the same stillness. Walk through the streets at dusk, and you would see it. In a narrow alley, a child slumped in unnatural slumber, his mother staring blankly at the wall. In a grand house, a hostess seated beneath a glittering chandelier, her jeweled hand trembling slightly as she lifts her cup. Different lives, same shadow. The city itself began to feel haunted. The fog thickened, swallowing the outlines of faces, blurring the edges of buildings. Gas lamps flickered uncertainly, each circle of light shrinking against the mist. And within that fog, the figures of women appeared ghost-like, whether in silk gowns or worn shawls. Whether stepping from carriages or stumbling from tenements, they moved slowly, their eyes vacant, their voices faint. To pass them in the street was to feel a chill, as though London itself were inhabited not only by the living, but by the half-vanished. People noticed. They whispered. Some spoke of frailty, others of fashion. Some said women were naturally delicate, unsuited for the pace of modern life. Few admitted what they truly feared, that the medicine meant to soothe was draining the very life from those it touched. To name it was dangerous. To remain silent was easier. But silence could not disguise the truth. The ghost ladies were not isolated tragedies. They were a pattern, a movement, a quiet epidemic sweeping across the city, crossing class, wealth, and age. London, for all its noise and ambition, was becoming a city of ghosts. Eleanor's window was only one among thousands. Behind other windows, other silhouettes waited motionless, pale, clutching bottles as if they were lifelines. Some were mothers, some wives, some daughters, each one hollowed, each one bound by the same substance. And though no one spoke it aloud, every passerby could feel it. Something vital was slipping away from London itself. The empire boasted of progress, of science, of modernity. But in its very heart, life was being drained quietly, elegantly, inexorably. And so the question grew larger. It was no longer only, how did this happen to Eleanor? Or to one mother, one child, one family? The question pressed heavier, darker. As the fog closed in, how long could an entire city survive while it drifted into silence? The city was restless, though it would not admit it. Behind the roar of carriages and the clang of factories, another sound had begun, a quieter one, printed in ink, murmured over breakfast tables and in taverns at night. The newspapers were speaking softly, carefully. At first, the words were cautious, wrapped in polite concern. An unsettling frailty among our women, one headline read. Another spoke of the modern nervous condition. Doctors were quoted, suggesting that the pace of life had become too harsh for delicate constitutions. No one named the vial outright. No one dared accuse laudanum. Yet between the lines, the implication lingered. Readers understood. They had seen it in their own homes, their own streets, the pale wives, the hollow-eyed daughters, the mothers too silent to soothe their children. They recognized the truth, though it was veiled in euphemism. Other papers, less cautious, hinted more directly. Small columns buried near the back spoke of infants lost to overswarming. Pamphlets distributed by reformers warned of danger in the bottle. A satirical sketch showed a woman at tea, her eyes blank, the cup labeled laudanum in bold strokes. The caption read, "The Fashionable Ghost." It was a joke, but the kind of joke that unsettled. The chemists responded with advertisements. Pages were filled with ornate lettering, bold assurances, safe, reliable, a friend in every household. Drawings showed mothers cradling peaceful infants, ladies reclining with serene smiles. If whispers of danger grew louder, the advertisements grew larger, drowning doubt in promises of comfort. And so the press became a battlefield of shadows. On one side, reformers and satirists, hinting that something was wrong. On the other, chemists and doctors defending the miracle cure. In the middle stood the public, torn between what they trusted and what they feared. Families clipped the cautious articles, folded them away, never speaking of them aloud. Husbands read them with furrowed brows, then looked across the table at wives too pale, too quiet, and said nothing. Mothers glanced at the words about infants overdosed and tucked the pamphlets into drawers. Unwilling to admit the truth to themselves, Eleanor's husband saw one such article. The headline spoke of a disturbing dependence among ladies of society. He read it twice, slowly, his hand tightening on the page. He thought of Eleanor, of the bottles that emptied too quickly, of her stillness by the window. For a moment, he wanted to confront her, to demand she stop. But then he folded the paper, tucked it beneath the ledger on his desk, and spoke nothing of it. The silence was easier, and silence was what society chose. The whispers in the press never grew into a shout. Editors feared losing advertisers. Doctors feared losing trust. Families feared shame. And so the truth remained in the margins, hinted but unspoken. A ghost printed in ink. Yet once a whisper begins, it does not vanish. It lingers, passing from mouth to mouth, from paper to parlor, from street to street. London was beginning to suspect the ghost ladies were no longer invisible. They were ink on paper, satire on a broadsheet, rumor in the marketplace. The epidemic could no longer be hidden completely, but suspicion is not action. For now, the city remained in denial, balancing uneasily between trust and fear. The vials continued to sell. The cordial continued to pour. The children continued to sleep too deeply, and the women continued to fade. The press had spoken, yes, but it had only whispered, and whispers, left unanswered, have a way of becoming. Screams. In Victorian London, A doctor's word carried the weight of scripture. They walked in tall hats and dark coats, their black bags heavy with bottles and instruments. Symbols of knowledge in a city desperate for order. Families trusted them more than priests, more than politicians. When a doctor prescribed, one obeyed, and again and again. The prescription was laudanum. It was, for the physician, a miracle. A woman arrived trembling with nerves, and after a few drops, she left calm. A child coughed through the night, and with a spoonful of cordial, he slept. A man complained of headaches from endless clerical work, and the tincture eased him in minutes. To a profession often powerless against disease, laudanum was proof that medicine could deliver certainty. But certainty is dangerous when it blinds. Doctors began to notice a pattern. Patients returned paler than before, their cheeks hollow, their voices flat. They spoke not only of pain, but of restlessness, of needing more. Some begged for larger bottles, insisting the small ones did not last. Others confessed, in whispers, that they could no longer sleep without it. The signs were there, but the language to describe them was not. Words like dependence and addiction belonged to another century. To the Victorian doctor, the answer was simpler. Delicate nerves, weak constitutions, the burdens of womanhood. If patients required more laudanum, it was not the drug's fault. It was the patient's weakness. So the bottles kept passing. Some doctors truly believed in it. Others doubted quietly, but lacked courage to say so. A few whispered to colleagues of disturbing cases, of women fading rather than healing, of infants to silent. But those whispers were drowned beneath the chorus of praise. To condemn laudanum was to condemn themselves, for it was in their bags, their ledgers, their very livelihood. Eleanor's doctor was such a man. He had visited her once, long ago, when her sleepless nights began. He had prescribed laudanum gently, assuring her husband it was safe, that all ladies of refinement use it. Now, months later, when her husband returned to him in quiet worry, the doctor only nodded gravely. She must take care not to overstrain herself, he said. Rest, quiet a few drops when needed. It is the way of delicate women. He did not visit again. He did not want to see. This was denial, dressed in respectability. To the doctor, it was easier to believe in fragile nerves than to face the truth that his cure was the poison. Easier to prescribe again than to admit ignorance. Easier to protect his authority than to protect his patients. And so the profession became complicit. Not out of malice, but out of pride, habit, fear. They were men of science in an age that worshipped progress. To question laudanum was to question progress itself. And progress, like empire, was not to be doubted. Meanwhile, the patients continued to fade. Women who should have recovered grew thinner, quieter. Children lulled by cordial did not thrive. Families whispered but did not confront. And doctors, when summoned, prescribed the same bottles, wrote the same words, offered the same reassurance. This will help. This is safe. Trust me. The denial of the doctors gave denial to the city. If the men of medicine did not sound the alarm, why should anyone else? If they said it was frailty, then frailty it must be. If they said it was safe, then it must be safe. And thus the epidemic spread, hidden beneath the cloak of professional authority. But truth cannot be silenced forever. The ghost ladies multiplied, their presence too visible, their absence too heavy. And though the doctors turned away, others began to speak, formers, writers, preachers' voices outside the profession, daring to name what the physicians would not. And in that growing chorus of doubt, London's silence began to tremble. When doctors would not speak, others did. The silence that cloaked London began to crack, not with the roar of science, but with the murmur of conscience in pulpits. Preachers raised their voices. One Sunday morning in Whitechapel, a minister looked out at his congregation, mothers pale and tired, children to quiet, and thundered words not easily forgotten. The Lord gave children their cries, not to burden us, but to remind us of their need. Woe to the city that silences them with poison. His parishioners shifted uneasily. Some nodded in agreement. Others looked away, unwilling to admit the truth. Yet the words lingered. Pamphlets began to circulate, cheaply printed, passed from hand to hand in markets and meeting halls. They carried titles like "The Silent Scourge" and "Poison in the Nursery." Reformers, many of them women who had lost children or watched friends fade, wrote with passion and fury. They told of infants who slept too deeply, of wives who grew hollow, of families undone by the very bottles sold as salvation. The newspapers, emboldened by these voices, printed sharper words. Small columns spoke openly of laudanum. Reformist weeklies published exposes of chemists profiting from grief. Satirists drew sharper sketches, a bottle labeled laudanum looming over a cradle, a lady of fashion with hollow eyes sipping tea in a haunted parlor. The laughter these drawings provoked was uneasy, for everyone knew the joke was true. Charitable workers saw it most directly. In the East End, women from church missions visited cramped tenements, bringing bread, blankets, and prayers. They found infants silent in their cradles, mothers slumped in exhaustion, cordial bottles half empty on shelves. They spoke of it in reports, pleading for reform, urging the government to act. Few listened, but the accounts were written, the testimonies preserved. Not all were kind. Some reformers, filled with zeal, condemned the mothers themselves. They called them careless, sinful, unfit. They did not see the poverty, the endless labor, the lack of choice. Yet even in their harshness, they spread awareness. They forced the city to look where it wished not to. And slowly, a chorus grew. It was not loud enough to stop the bottles, not yet. But it was loud enough to trouble the silence. Husbands began to question doctors more boldly. Neighbors whispered of alternatives, remedies less strong, less dangerous. And in certain churches, the sermons rang clear. Comfort bought with poison is no comfort at all. Eleanor never heard these voices. She sat by her window still, the vial always near. The pamphlets did not reach her, the sermons passed unheard, yet she was part of the reason they existed. Every ghost lady was. Their stillness was the evidence reformers held up to the city, proof that progress had a cost, proof that silence was not natural, proof that something must change. The reformers did not yet have power, but they had words. And words, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. London was beginning to listen. Every whisper of reform met an answering laugh. When a pamphlet declared poison in the nursery, chemists replied with advertisements twice as large. Godfrey's cordial the mothers, friend for generations. The pages of newspapers filled with ornate borders and smiling illustrations of peaceful infants in cradles. Mothers looking serene, fathers reassured. Trusted by every household, the captions proclaimed. To question the cordial, they implied, was to question motherhood itself. Doctors joined in the defense. Some gave earnest speeches at medical societies, insisting laudanum was safe, if used with moderation. They pointed to centuries of use, to thousands of grateful patients. If harm occurs, one physician declared, it is due to misuse, not the medicine itself. Shall we condemn fire because some burn their hands? The audience nodded, eager for certainty, unwilling to see the slow hollowing in their own practices. And among the wealthy, the mockery was sharper still. At soirees and salons, reformers were dismissed with elegant shrugs. A crusade against laudanum. A lady laughed, her jeweled fingers resting lightly on her teacup. Shall we ban sugar next? because some grow fat? The guests chuckled, politely, never noticing the faint glaze in her eyes. The vial hidden discreetly in her reticule satirical papers, eager for humor, lampooned the reformers. One cartoon showed a wild-eyed preacher chasing mothers through the streets, snatching bottles from their aprons while babies screamed. The caption read, "The new tyranny, let the infants cry." Readers laughed, relieved to treat the issue as exaggeration rather than truth. It was easier to mock than to confront. Even among the poor, resistance was strong. Mothers, exhausted, bristled at the suggestion they should give up the cordial. "Will you rock my baby while I work the mill?" One woman snapped at a visiting reformer, "Will you feed him when I cannot?" They did not want lectures. They wanted silence. They wanted survival. And the bottle gave them both. Thus reform met ridicule, and ridicule prevailed. For every sermon, there were 10 advertisements. For every pamphlet, there was a chorus of laughter. The reformers were loud in conviction, but weak in influence. While the sellers of laudanum had wealth, authority, and the public's trust. Eleanor never heard the debates, but she lived their outcome. As long as doctors defended and chemists advertised, her husband would not forbid her vial. As long as society mocked reformers, her silence was excused as delicacy, not danger. The tide of denial protected her habit, even as it hollowed her away, and so the city continued, half believing, half doubting, caught between whispers of danger and waves of denial. The laughter of society drowned out the cries of reform, and in that laughter, the ghosts multiplied. But laughter cannot hold forever. Mockery may silence reform for a time, but the truth was written in too many faces, too many families undone. The ghost ladies were no longer hidden in shadows. They were visible on every street, every class, every home, and soon, even ridicule would not be enough. By the late years of the century, the pattern could no longer be dismissed. Too many women pale and vacant in drawing rooms. Too many children, stilled too deeply in their cradles. Too many families living in houses where silence had replaced laughter. The city still laughed at reformers, still trusted its doctors, still bought its bottles. But beneath the noise of denial, a truth grew undeniable. London was sick, not with plague, not with fever, but with silence. It was a new kind of epidemic. One without contagion, without visible sores, without the tolling of bells for the dead. It spread not through breath or touch, but through habit, through trust, through every vial that passed from hand to hand. A cure that slipped so easily into daily life that it hollowed the city without raising alarm. Numbers told part of the story. Mortality reports whispered of infants lost in sleep. Medical journals, when read carefully, revealed cases of nervous collapse in women prescribed long courses of laudanum. Even coroner's notes, tucked away in dusty ledgers, hinted at overdoses no one wished to name. Yet still, no great outcry came. For each fact, there was always denial, always laughter. Always another advertisement promising safety. The greater story was written not in numbers, but in faces. The ghost ladies, by their windows. The children too quiet in their beds. The husbands, lingering longer at work, unable to face the emptiness at home. The mothers of the East End, dosing their infants and whispering prayers that they might wake. The ladies of Mayfair sipping their tea with steady hands and vacant eyes. Everywhere, across every class, the same hollowness spread, and yet the city went on. Carriages rattled, markets bustled, factories roared. Empire expanded abroad, inventions flourished at home. London celebrated its progress, blind to the cost carved silently into its people. It was as if the city itself had chosen denial, wrapping its own decay in fog, trusting that if it was not named, it was not real. But epidemics do not remain silent forever. Every ghost lady was a testimony, every lost infant a warning. Reformers whispered, preachers thundered, satirists mocked, but the true weight lay in the sheer accumulation of lives undone, and the weight was growing too heavy to ignore. Eleanor was only one among thousands. Yet in her stillness by the window, in the vial clenched always in her hand, she embodied the epidemic entire. She was not merely a woman fading. She was a symbol of a city quietly destroying itself while calling it cure. The ghost epidemic had no wards, no hospitals, no quarantines. It lived in homes, in hearts, in silences. It was as vast as London itself, as ordinary as a spoonful, as devastating as famine. And soon, the silence would break. The city still moved, but it no longer moved with confidence. The carriages rattled, the markets cried their wares, the bells of St. Paul's tolled as they always had. Yet beneath the rhythm of London, something unsettled pulsed. It was in the way people glanced over their shoulders, in the way conversations trailed off, in the way laughter at dinner tables grew thinner. London was uneasy. The whispers had grown too many to ignore. Too many infants buried before their first year, their deaths explained away with words like frailty or convulsions. Too many wives who sat in drawing rooms as silent ornaments, their once bright voices gone. Too many households hollowed by absence. What had once been dismissed as nerves, as fashion, as exaggeration, now pressed on the conscience of the city. On street corners, newsboys shouted headlines that hinted at trouble, concerns over infant remedies. One paper cried, "The fashionable ailment of ladies," said another. Few dared print the word laudanum, but everyone knew what was meant. Readers lowered their papers slowly, eyes shadowed with recognition. They had seen it in their homes, in their neighbors, in themselves. The unease reached parlors too. In Mayfair, ladies whispered over tea, exchanging glances as they stirred their cups. Each knew her own reliance, each suspected her neighbors. What had once been a quiet bond of secrecy now felt like exposure. The satire in the newspapers stung. The jokes were no longer harmless, they were mirrors. In the East End, mothers began to hide their bottles. When reformers knocked at doors, offering bread and sermons, the cordial was pushed quickly into cupboards, tucked under blankets. Some women defended it fiercely, but others warier, sadder looked away, ashamed. They knew what it did. They knew the price. But poverty left them no choice. Even the doctors, once so certain, had grown cautious. Their ledgers showed too many returning patients, their hands trembling, their eyes hollow. They prescribed, with less cheer, more hesitation. Some spoke quietly among themselves of dependence. Others avoided the subject altogether, unwilling to pierce the veil of authority. The denial still stood, but it wavered. Eleanor sat by her window, as she always had. But now, she was no longer just a woman fading. To those who passed in the street, she was something larger, a sign. A reminder that the comfort sold in bottles carried shadows too deep to ignore. Children still called her the ghost at the window, but adults looked up too. Their eyes filled not with amusement, but with dread, for they saw their own wives, their own daughters, their own mothers reflected in her stillness. The unease spread like fog, not shouted, not declared, but felt. In the way a husband lingered too long at his office. In the way a mother kissed her child too tightly before dosing him again. In the way a doctor hesitated with his pen above the prescription pad. The entire city seemed to hold its breath, aware of something it could no longer deny, but afraid to face. And yet the vials remained. Chemists' shelves were still lined. Advertisements still promised peace. The epidemic did not slow. It deepened, but the illusion of safety was cracking. And once cracked, it could not be repaired. London was uneasy, because it had begun to see itself clearly. A city that prided itself on progress, reason, an empire yet haunted by ghosts of its own making. The silence that once protected the lie was faltering, and in the faltering lay the promise of collapse. The question was no longer if the truth would break through, but when. Unease was no longer confined to the streets or the pages of newspapers. It seeped into kitchens and parlors, into bedrooms and nurseries, pressing against families like damp through brick. What had once been whispers could no longer be silenced. In Eleanor's house, the cracks widened. Her husband, who once chose silence over confrontation, now found his patience unraveling. He returned home to find the children whispering in corners, afraid to disturb their mother who sat again by the window, her hand curled around the vial. He set down his briefcase, with deliberate force, hoping she might startle, might look up. She did not. His words came sharper than before. "Eleanor, this cannot go on." But she only smiled faintly, the smile of someone far away, and said nothing. It was not defiance. It was absence. That, more than anger, broke him. He raised his voice. The children flinched, and still she sat silent. It was as though his fury, his grief, his very presence no longer reached her. He was a husband without a wife, a father trying to explain to children why their mother was both alive and gone. Other homes echoed the same scene. In Mayfair, arguments broke behind closed doors, muffled by thick curtains. Husbands accused wives of neglecting households, wives accused husbands of cruelty, and both turned again to silence rather than truth. The bottles remained on dressing tables, hidden in drawers, disguised as harmless. Families dined together in brittle quiet, each aware of the ghost among them, each unwilling or unable to speak it plainly. In the East End, the struggles were harsher. A father returned from the docks to find his infant still, the mother pale and shaking with exhaustion. He shouted, demanding why she had given the cordial again. She wept, insisting she had no choice, that the baby would not stop crying, that she could not work otherwise. His anger was not at her, but at the world that left them with nothing but a bottle to survive. Yet anger does not heal, and so silence followed shouting, and the cracks grew wider. Children bore the weight in ways no one wished to see. They learned to care for younger siblings because mothers could not. They grew wary of their father's tempers, wary too of their mother's stillness. Some grew resentful, some grew fearful, all grew older than their years. In their eyes was a knowledge too heavy. That comfort was poison, that safety was fragile, that the people they loved were fading before them. And yet, even as families strained, the bottles did not vanish. Too many mothers could not sleep without them. Too many husbands could not face the nights of weeping and anxiety without pouring a few drops for their wives. Too many children were silenced not by lullabies but by syrup. The very thing that hollowed the home was the thing that held it together, however poorly. To remove it seemed impossible. This was the edge London had reached. Families could no longer pretend. The ghost ladies were not curiosities, not whispers, not isolated tragedies. They were wives, mothers, daughters in every home. The epidemic was no longer silent. It was lived daily in the strained voices at dinner, in the fearful glances of children, in the brittle silences between husbands and wives. Eleanor's house was one of thousands, but in its silence, its distance, its cracks, it revealed the truth of them all. London's families stood at the edge, balancing between denial and collapse, clinging to bottles even as those bottles destroyed them. And the edge, once reached, could not hold forever. Every silence, if stretched too far, will break in London. The breaking points came quietly at first. A cradle one morning that did not stir. A mother found slumped in her chair. The vial slipped from her hand. A husband arriving home to discover his wife asleep at the table, unbreathing. These were not the deaths of plague, with bells tolling and processions of mourners. These were private catastrophes, contained within walls, whispered about only by neighbors, yet together they formed a chorus of collapse. In the East End, one such collapse began with a spoonful too many. A mother named Anne, weary after another night at the mill, dosed her infant again before leaving for work. The child never woke. When she returned to find him still, his lips faintly blue, her scream pierced the alley. Neighbors rushed, then hushed. Some muttered blame, some offered pity. The coroner's note read failure of the heart. The cordial bottle was not mentioned, but every mother on that street looked at their own bottles differently after that night. In Mayfair, collapse wore silks. A hostess known for her grace fainted at her own soirée, collapsing amid chandeliers and polished marble. Guests rushed to her side, only to find the vial in her pocket, half empty. Whispers spread like fire. She takes too much. They all do. The scandal was contained, her family insisting she had been unwell. But the laughter in Mayfair's parlors grew more brittle. Every teacup a reminder of the thin line between composure and catastrophe. And in Eleanor's house, the edge drew closer. Her husband, long resigned to her silence, returned one evening to find her motionless by the window. For one terrible moment, he believed she was gone. He shook her, called her name, his voice breaking. At last, her eyes opened, slow and distant. Relief swept through him, followed by fury. He shouted as the children watched, demanded she throw the vial away, demanded she return to them. She only blinked, faintly bewildered, as though he were speaking in another tongue. The vial remained in her hand. The breaking point had not come yet, but it was near. These were not isolated tragedies. They were patterns. Each home that reached its breaking point revealed what others feared but would not say aloud. Laudanum was not salvation, but betrayal. It had promised comfort, but delivered ruin. It had promised peace, but left only silence too deep, too final. The city began to murmur differently. Neighbors who once shrugged now whispered warnings. Newspapers, still cautious, published more stories of unfortunate cases. Reformers pointed to them as proof. Preachers thundered from pulpits. Satirists sharpened their pens. The laughter that had once mocked reform began to falter, for the evidence was now too close, too frequent. Breaking points are cruel, but they are also clarifying. They strip away denial. They force eyes open. They turn whispers into truths. London had reached that moment. The ghost epidemic was no longer hidden behind respectability or poverty. It was visible, undeniable. A shadow spread across the city. Entire Eleanor's story was still unfolding, her breaking point not yet reached. But in the streets, in the homes, in the cradles and the parlors, others had already crossed that threshold. And their silence, once so heavy, now screamed. London could no longer look away. It began with stories too raw to hide. A child in the East End, blue-lipped in his cradle. A lady of Mayfair, collapsed at a dinner, her vial clattering onto the floor. A seamstress, found lifeless at her workbench, her wages spent on bottles that promised relief. Each tragedy might once have been explained away: frailty, exhaustion, misfortune, but now they came too often, too close, too visible. London could no longer look aside. The newspapers, once hesitant, grew bolder. Columns that once spoke in euphemism now named the drug outright. Laudanum, a peril in every household, the poison we call a cure. Editors published accounts of families undone, of children lost, of wives hollowed. Pamphlets thundered from presses, some filled with statistics, others with raw grief. Letters from husbands, from mothers, from reformers who had watched too many funerals. The public, long comfortable in denial, began to stir. At markets, women whispered to each other about bottles hidden in cupboards. In taverns, men grumbled about wives, too pale, too absent. At church doors, reformers thrust pamphlets into reluctant hands. Even children carried the stories, chanting cruel rhymes about ladies who drink the ghost's tea. What had once been whispered was now shouted in alleys, argued in drawing rooms, debated in parliament corridors, and with outrage came fear. Some households emptied their cupboards in panic, pouring cordial down drains, smashing bottles against stone. Others defended it fiercely, insisting they could not live without it. That it was reformers who exaggerated, that their children would cry them mad if denied the cordial. London was divided, half desperate to abandon the drug, half clinging tighter, but all aware that the silence was broken. Chemists fought back with louder promises. Advertisements grew more elaborate, some even mocking reformers as hysterical. But the laughter no longer rang true. The public had seen too much. A mother who had lost a child could not be silenced by ornate lettering. A husband who buried his wife could not be swayed by drawings of peaceful ladies sipping tea. Trust, once so strong, had begun to fracture. Eleanor's husband read the headlines one evening by the fire. His hand shook as he folded the paper. He looked at his wife, still seated by the window, the vial resting in her lap. The paper's words echoed too clearly, a peril in every household. He realized, with a hollow weight, that the household described was his own. Preachers thundered from pulpits, their voices carrying into crowded streets. Shall we sacrifice our women and children for comfort? Shall we worship a bottle while our families turn to ghosts? Reformers gathered at halls, demanding laws, demanding limits, demanding that someone, at last, act. The outcry was uneven, fractured, sometimes cruel, but it was louder than it had ever been. The epidemic, once hidden in fog, now filled the air with its presence. It could no longer be dismissed as frailty, mocked as fashion, or excused as nerves. It was a crisis, and it had a name: laudanum, London. Had awoken, and once awake, it could not return to silence. London had shouted, at last. The silence was broken by headlines, by sermons, by cries in the marketplace. But shouting is not the same as change. Outcry demands action, and action requires courage, and courage was scarce in a city built on denial. The government debated in cautious tones. Some called for regulation, limits on sales, warnings from mothers, accountability for chemists. Others scoffed, dismissing reformers as hysterical. Shall we ban the very cure that sustains our people? One politician asked, his voice heavy with irony. Next, they will ask us to outlaw bread because men choke upon it. The chamber chuckled, but the laughter was brittle. Too many had seen too much. Doctors, too, found themselves divided. Some insisted on moderation, clinging to the idea that laudanum was safe if used wisely. Others admitted, in private, if not in public, that the drug was no cure but a curse. A few began to refuse prescriptions, their reputations suffering as patients sought out more compliant physicians. Denial was easier, but truth pressed harder, and families, torn between need and fear, wavered in confusion. Some smashed their bottles, vowing never to touch them again. Others clutched them tighter, muttering that they could not endure without them. Children watched their parents argue, caught between relief and resentment. Husbands demanded abstinence. Wives wept that they could not comply. The epidemic had become not only a matter of medicine, but of marriage, of trust, of love strained to breaking. Eleanor's house was caught in this storm. Her husband had begun to plead more than scold. He read the papers aloud to her, his voice breaking as he described mothers burying children, husbands burying wives. "Eleanor, do you not see?" he begged. But she only shook her head faintly, eyes glazed, her hands still curled around the vial. She saw, perhaps, but she could not let go. The reckoning had come to her doorstep, yet she remained bound by the amber liquid's promise of peace. The city mirrored her struggle. It knew the truth now. It had named a poison. But knowing is not the same as changing. Habit clung as tightly as fear. For every family that cast the drug aside, another still relied upon it. For every voice demanding reform, another whispered excuses. The reckoning was coming, but London hesitated on its threshold, uncertain whether it had the strength to walk through. And yet, history does not wait for hesitation. The ghosts were too many, the deaths too frequent, the truth too heavy. Already, reformers pushed harder, demanding laws, demanding justice. Already, the press sharpened its language, calling laudanum by its true name, epidemic. Already, families faced choices they could no longer avoid. The city stood at the edge of change, not yet across, not yet free, but no longer blind. What had once been trusted, without question, was now weighed with dread. What had once been salvation was now recognized as betrayal. London had reached the moment between denial and reckoning, the breath before the verdict, and in that breath, the question hung: would the city save itself or continue to fade into ghosts? And so we close the story of London's ghost ladies, of bottles trusted too much, of comfort that hollowed more than it healed. It began with a few drops so small, so harmless, a cure for sleepless nights, a blessing for restless children, a friend to weary hearts. But drop by drop, the cure became a hunger, the hunger became a silence, and the silence became a city of ghosts. We saw Eleanor by her window, drifting farther from her children, her husband, from herself. We saw mothers of the East End, forced to trade cries for quiet, love for survival. We saw the ladies of Mayfair, elegant in silk, but absent in spirit, praised for serenity that was only drugged stillness. We watched as the silence thickened, until London itself seemed haunted not by death, but by lives half-lived. We watched families fracture, scandals break, children slip into sleep too deep. And we watched the city awaken at last, its denial shattered, its outcry rising, standing at the threshold of reckoning. The story belongs to history, but its echo belongs to us. For even now, in our own time, we reach for bottles, for pills, for promises of quick relief. We trust what soothes, what silences, what spares us the burden of struggle. And perhaps, in our haste for comfort, we risk repeating the same mistake, forgetting that every cure carries a shadow. The ghosts of Victorian London do not walk our streets, but their lesson does. So as we close this tale, take a moment to sit with it, to feel the weight of silence and the cost of comfort, to remember Eleanor's window, the children's stillness, the city that almost forgot itself. And if this story has stirred something in you, whether unease, or wonder, or simply the need to remember, stay with us. There are many more stories where history whispers, warnings to the present. Subscribe if you wish to follow those whispers. Leave a like if you believe stories like this deserve to be told. And if you are still awake, write a single one in the comments so we know you are here, listening in the quiet. Good night. And may the ghosts of the past guide us gently, not haunt us.